Welcome to Professor Lisa Vanhala's inaugural lecture. Professorial inaugural lectures are an opportunity to celebrate the research and careers of colleagues who have been newly promoted to or hired as UCL professors. We've been fortunate to have a series of these lectures throughout this year, and it's been tremendously rewarding to convene and hear about the outstanding work of colleagues old and new. I am here as head of Department of Political Science to welcome everyone to this event, and then to get swiftly out of the way so that Professor Chris Hilson from the School of Law at the University of Reading can give a proper substantive introduction. We will then proceed to Professor Vanhala's talk. After that, Professor Stephen Vaughan from UCL's Faculty of Laws will give an appreciation. Finally, we'll all head over to the Haldane Room for a drinks reception. It's traditional for professorial inaugural lectures to not include a Q&A, and we will be following that tradition today. Lisa Vanhala joined the department in, I believe, 2011. Her promotion to professor was actually back in 2019, very nearly 4 years ago. Various circumstances, which you may remember, have delayed this celebration of her work until today. As you will note, both Lisa's introducer and her appreciator today are scholars of law. This reflects the interdisciplinarity of Lisa's work, which uses political science and sociological approaches to study the role of law, norms, and judicial institutions in governance. Given that they are here to talk about Lisa's intellectual contributions, I will confine myself to Lisa's many contributions to our department. Lisa has been an outstanding departmental citizen through the time she's been here. She served as our Director of Research from 2017 to 2020. In that time, she led development of a departmental research vision, strategy, and a 5-year plan for implementation. Indeed, earlier today, many of us here were in a departmental research away day, taking stock of how we've done in implementing that 5-year plan and where we should go from here. The vision Lisa led in building 5 years ago remains an excellent statement of our ambitions. The research strategy identifies many ways in which we have in fact made tremendous progress as a department over those 5 years. Lisa was not just involved in setting out that plan, but also in leading on delivering it during the first 2 years of those 5 years, before handing it off to her successors as departmental directors of research. Both of us who held those roles, myself and Niels, who I believe is here somewhere, have very much appreciated having this vision and this roadmap for what the department is trying to achieve. One key element of that research strategy, which I think was particularly close to Lisa's heart, was improving departmental mentoring and career development support. So this year, Lisa has taken on a role as Deputy Head of Department for Academic Careers. Lisa is an outstanding mentor and coach of junior academic staff, as well as postdocs and PhD students. Our current division of labor is that she conducts annual appraisals for most junior academic staff in the department, and I conduct annual appraisals for most senior academic staff in the department, which I think is a fantastic deal for our junior colleagues. There is much more I could say about Lisa's contributions, including her leadership on new research and teaching initiatives in the department related to climate politics and policy, but I am at this point edging beyond the remit of a welcome and into that of an introduction, so I'm going to hand over to Professor Chris Hilson, who is here to fulfill that role today.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight to do the introduction on behalf of Lisa. I think the thing with the inaugurals is it's such a wonderful chance to celebrate academic achievement, and we don't really do it enough. So an inaugural is such a great opportunity for us to be able to mark that. And I think with Lisa's case, there's so much to celebrate, okay? And that, I mean, those of you that know Lisa will know that already, but it's my job in this introduction to just give you a little bit of a taste of many of those achievements and contributions that we're here to mark. And celebrate we must. And I think, you know, one thing that we definitely need to celebrate is a kind of structural thing. I mean, political science doesn't have that many female chairs, actually. So the fact that we have, that we're celebrating somebody that is a woman chair this evening, I think is something that we should actually be taking notice of. But we're obviously here not just to celebrate that structural point, but to celebrate many of the individual achievements of Lisa. And that's really what I want to focus on. Okay, so when did Lisa and I first meet? Well, we first met at Lisa's DPhil Viva. And I want you to picture the scene. It was an Oxford College room, and it was a massive room with a massive table, and it was really quite intimidating. And that was, for me as the external examiner, I dread to think actually how Lisa was feeling. But my one abiding memory is that it was really cold. Okay? It was a really freezing room. And me and the internal examiner had to go and get a porter to light a coal fire in the room, which has a slightly odd resonance given the title of today's lecture. And I don't think either of us would probably have asked for that today, but it was a while ago. So that was when our paths first met. And the Viva and the DPhil were, as you can imagine, superb. I mean, just really, you know, I was blown away. So it was no surprise when the book that came from the DPhil thesis, which is Disability Rights and Legal Mobilisation, when it won a whole load of prizes. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't any surprise to me that happened. You know, a terrific book. And I think the book really moved the literature on the study of law and courts within political science, but also the literature on law and society, law and social movements. It moved all of that literature on in an incredible way. And I think it moves it on in terms of political science in that political scientists have been used to looking at courts from the perspective very much of the judges in those courts and looking at, you know, things like the judicialization of politics. But there hadn't been such a focus on who was using the courts and why it was that they were deciding to litigate. And Lisa's work really brought that out. And having started in that book and with her thesis with the disability movement, Lisa's academic work then moved on to take that to other fields. And in particular, and this is really, I think, where she's built her academic reputation, looking at legal mobilization by the environmental movement, and then legal mobilization by the climate movement. And, you know, that's the field that, you know, lawyers have done a lot of work in as well, which is climate change litigation. But Lisa's work, and you know, she had a number of pieces in, you know, some of the top stellar journals like Law and Society Review, Comparative Political Studies, Wire's Climate Change. You know, there's a whole range of really top journals that we could mention there that work's appeared in. But I think what all of those pieces do is to move the focus away from just looking at court cases, and particularly the kind of landmark court cases, which, to be honest, most lawyers focus on. Yeah, there's that kind of sense in which, oh, there's a shiny new case from a Supreme Court, that's the one that we're going to be looking at. Whereas, you know, Lisa's work, and I think one of the great strengths of Lisa's work, is that she's really interested in methodology as well as the kind of substance of law and political science. And I think that really comes through in that work. And that kind of careful crafting of the work around a real kind of rigor with the methodology means that she's asked some really interesting questions which lawyers, generally speaking, haven't asked. Okay, and those questions involve, yeah, things like who is litigating? You know, why are those people litigating? And what are the outcomes of that litigation? You know, what are the ways in which litigation on the environment, on climate, what are the ways in which that litigation is or isn't achieving social change that the litigants are looking for. A number of Lisa's climate articles in particular have been jointly authored. Okay, and I mean, we did an early piece together in Law and Policy, which was a special issue. And I mention that because I think this is one of Lisa's other terrific strengths, actually. That I mean, she's very much not the lone scholar, and that's not the point I'm wanting to make here. I think it's neither is it that she has a kind of encyclopedic memory for pieces of work, which always impresses me. I mean, I've been in many conferences with Lisa, and I'll be sitting at the back thinking, oh yeah, there's that piece by such and such, you know, what was that piece? And, you know, it's somewhere in the back of my mind. And then, you know, you turn to Lisa and she'll say not only that piece and know what it is and know who wrote it, she'll know about 4 or 5 other pieces as well. And I think the reason I mention that is not to suggest that Lisa's strength is having a kind of encyclopedic memory, although she may have that. I think it reflects a real kind of inclusiveness, actually, of her scholarship. And I like to think in that way, Lisa is not just a kind of accomplished musician academically, but she's also the kind of leader of an orchestra, okay? And she has brought people up with her in that respect. So she's very generous with quoting other people and very inclusive in the way she quotes other people. And I think that's a sign of, yeah, a really remarkable scholar, actually, because there are very few people that can do it with that sort of skill and panache. And I think that leads me on to the next point, and I'm conscious of time, so I will move on to this one quite quickly. Lisa's work has also been not just academic, okay? She's done a lot of stuff which has been very impactful beyond academia. So she's done quite a lot of consulting work for philanthropical organizations, NGOs, you know, people like the Barings Foundation, Greenpeace International, BBC Children in Need. You know, she's written reports about use of the courts and legal mobilization for a lot of kind of really august organizations like that. And I think, again, that's part of her ability to not just see her academic role in a narrow sense. It's about making a difference and trying to ensure that the academic work is having an impact, you know, beyond the institution that she works in. And she's done a lot of that work, I know, with her colleague Jackie Kingham, who I think is here as well. So, yeah, I think that again, is a great feature of Lisa and her work, that she is obviously a terrific lone scholar, you know, and writes great stuff on her own. But, yeah, it's that ability to kind of get on with other people and to work with other people and do so really effectively. I think there aren't very many academics that do that quite so well. Okay, so, well, inevitably in quite a short introduction, which probably should have been slightly shorter, I can only paint quite a quick picture of some of the many accomplishments that Lisa has achieved in what's still, you know, well, I like to think Lisa's probably mid-career, I would say, but, you know, we can discuss that one afterwards over a drink, perhaps. But I think, you know, we all hope that, you know, there's going to be an awful lot more good work to come. And I think, like me, you're going to be looking forward to hearing about the lecture that she's going to be giving tonight. So, yeah, please join me in welcoming Lisa to the floor to give her lecture today, which is entitled Governing the End, the Making of Climate Change, Loss and Damage. And it just struck me actually while I was sitting down there that the wording above that is probably quite apposite as well. So, yes, thank you very much, and over to you, Lisa.
Good, thank you. I am so delighted to be here, and thank you to Chris for those very, very kind words. The occasion of one's inaugural lecture is obviously a wonderful moment to take stock of one's career, where one's come from, where one is headed. And I've always really interested in hearing about why people study what they study. And so I've been reflecting on that a lot. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is this book project I'm working on entitled Governing the End, the Making of Climate Change, Loss and Damage. It's going to come out with Chicago University Press as part of their Law and Society series. But I've also really taken the last few days to think about why have I spent now almost 10 years thinking about loss and damage? Like, what is that about? And so in addition to offering the talk I'm going to give today, I want to start with some kind of more personal reflections on what's been driving this, and on really what has tied together my work on human rights and legal mobilization and climate. And one is an interest in questions of responsibility and accountability. Where and how do we decide what a problem is, what a policy problem is, and who's responsible for addressing that problem? I've always been interested in the role of law and legal actors and how the law is brought to life through processes of mobilization. But I think, as Chris noted, another theme of my work, even the solo authored work, is that it's always the product of collaboration. None of this research would be possible without So I was saying to a colleague earlier today that I was really worried I wasn't going to be able to get through this bit because I was going to cry. And Kristen, where is she? Kristen said, "You're a professor now. You can do what you want." And she also said, "What's that song? Remember that song? It's my party cry if I want to." So I've been telling people I'm a little bit worried about getting through this part. So you're going to have to bear with me. I know it's particularly difficult for a British audience. But this is who I am, and I'm here, and I'm going to be doing it this way. I have had the privilege of working with many excellent people and organizations, and I would like to take some time to thank them now, if I can get through this. I have practiced this without crying. It takes about 5 minutes. I practice it with crying. It takes somewhere between 7 and 8. So that's what we're looking at here, okay? Thank you so much to all of you for being here today to celebrate with us. Some of you may or may not have known what an inaugural lecture is, and there's a lot of discussion stuff, and it's really nice for me and for my family who are here at the back. And so I'm really, really pleased that you could be here today to celebrate with us. Another colleague in a conversation today said, "I'm really worried the topic of your talk is going to be really, a bit depressing. And to manage expectations, it is." But that's where I want to start. I want to thank my colleagues. I just think this is the most fantastic department, and we are going from strength to strength, and it has been a real honor for me to come up through this department. I want to thank all of the heads of department that have led the department while I've been here. David Cohen, who hired me, Jennifer Hudson, who has now become our dean, and Ben Lauderdale, our current head of department. They have all empowered me and supported me throughout my career. They have given me a push when I have needed it, and they have taught me a great deal about leadership, and I am incredibly grateful to them for that. I want to thank my funder, the European Research Council. They take a big risk on projects like this, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity, mainly because it has allowed me to hire an absolutely amazing team of people that I have been able to work with over the last 5 years. So I want to mention Elisa Calieri, who's a senior research fellow on the project, Noah Walker-Crawford, who's here as a postdoctoral fellow with the department, Angelica Johansson, who recently defended her PhD in our department, Frederica Hartz, who has been a very hardworking research assistant for me and who's doing her PhD in Cambridge, Montserrat Gomez de Cuenca, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Montse, I'm really sorry, I've never actually said your last name out loud before. But she's in the law department here at UCL and has done some great work with us in Chile. Frances Butler, who's doing her PhD in geography here at UCL and co-authored a methodology piece with us. And Mikhail Robertson, who studied law here a few years ago, has been a research assistant on the project, was a co-author on a paper that we wrote that won a prize, and is now part of the team leading the small island states in the negotiations as we speak. It's happening today and tomorrow on this very topic. And I'd like to acknowledge a new research assistant who's joining the team, Vega Osman Bishop. I'd also like to acknowledge our collaborators. We have done work in Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Fiji, Tuvalu, Peru, and Chile. And they have all brought so much knowledge and insights, and I have learned so much from working with them. It's really humbling and been such a privilege. There are others here who I have worked with over the years. Sasha Aristotle, one of my former research assistants, now studying international law at NYU, and so many other colleagues in the department. I have to say I'm particularly proud because two of our core team members aren't here today because they are sitting at the negotiation table, one with the EU negotiation delegation, one with the small island developing states. And so while we have often sat around my dinner table late into the night talking about loss and damage, it's such a pleasure and privilege to see them thriving in their new roles sitting at the negotiation table. This gets harder and harder as we go on, so just to give you I feel a little bit better for the world that those two people are there doing that, just a little bit. I've done a lot of work on climate litigation, collaboration with Chris early on, lots of conversations with Stephen. My co-author, Joanna Setzer, is here. And I think there's a lot of tying in of that work that I've done on litigation and in thinking about loss and damage, and I'll tie a little bit of that together. Chris mentioned Jackie Kingham, who's here. She's come down from Edinburgh. She's been my partner in the consulting work that we've done over the last 7 years. It's been such a joy. I cannot tell you, working with someone who is so knowledgeable about the law. I can't look at it right now. And about human rights, so passionate about social justice, and just so supportive of everyone around her all the time. And I am so, so lucky to have her in my life. I started this project as I experienced a series of personal losses and a real sense of dislocation. And oh, there goes my mom. Thanks, guys, for sticking with me. It really helps. It really helps. It pulls me back. Okay. So friends and family really carried me through that period, and there are too many to mention, and many in this room, but I especially want to thank Jill and Tim, and Corin and Al, and Rosh and Alexander, who are here, and Allison, and my book club, and I think there are a few people from my book club here, and it keeps me going, thinking that one day the two books that are coming out of this project might be read by that group of people, and I'm not sure it'll ever compare to like Anna Karenina, but like here's hoping, I think. I want to thank Stephen Humphreys, who came into my life a few years ago. He has become my partner in crime, and he provides an incredible amount of emotional support to me and intellectual challenge. I have become a braver, more critically capable scholar because of him, and he and his son Oscar have also brought a lot of fun and a little bit more rebellious thinking into the lives of my son and I. I'm really grateful to you, Stephen. Thank you. My family. So there's absolutely no way I could have become a professor without the support of my mother and sister. They provided childcare, particularly when I became a single mother. My mom has traveled around the world with me. Not always a hardship. We have spent time in Florence and Antigua and New York and Berkeley, but I really wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for all the support that she has given me, not in terms just of childcare, but also the material and emotional support. My sister, who couldn't be here today, she's in Beijing, has also really been a source of strength for me through a difficult period and is my biggest cheerleader. My father nurtured my interest in politics and really a deep appreciation of nature. And it's now only 10 years after his passing that I really understand the undertaking of this project as a way of leaning into loss. And I see this research as a way of processing grief, my own personal grief at this series of losses, but also grief for what we are losing now, and anticipatory grief, what there is to lose. And we all process grief differently, and I think I understand now this project as my way of doing that. And finally, I want to say thank you to my son, Sam Abercrombie. At 8 years old, he has lived with this project his entire life. And this lecture starts with him and is going to end with him. So when Sam was about 3 years old, we were playing doctor. And he was excellent. He took my temperature, he listened to my heart, he looked in my eyes and my ears, he packed up his instruments, and he looked me in the eye. Right? Excellent bedside manner. Proud mama. He looked me in the eyes, and he shook his head, and he said, "It's not good news, Mummy." And I said, "Oh my goodness, doctor, what is it?" And he said, "Mummy, you have climate change." And I thought two things in that moment. One, I have got to stop talking so much about work at the dinner table. And two, he's absolutely right. We're at a moment now where we all have climate change. Whether we live in those places that are bearing the worst of its impacts, or whether we are privileged enough to live in places that are less exposed or vulnerable to those impacts, climate change now entails a degree of everyday loss for all of us. A study that came out in Nature 2 years ago, based on a survey of 10,000 young people across 10 different countries, asked how they felt about climate change and government responses to it. This is the widest ranging study of its type. And the research found that most respondents were concerned about climate change, with nearly 60% saying they felt very worried or extremely worried. So this project takes the idea that climate change is going to be the end as a starting point. Right, the science is clear now. We know that loss is an inevitable consequence of a warming world. Climate change is going to be the end, and already is, the end of some lives and livelihoods. People are going to have to leave their homes and their homelands, and traditional identities and social cohesion is under threat. And this raises big questions, right? How do we govern this problem or these sets of problems? Are our existing institutions up to scratch? How can we develop policies to manage these kinds of losses? So over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what loss and damage is and why it matters. I'm going to touch a bit on the methodological approach, and that's been really one of the aims of this project, is to think about what's the best way to kind of uncover what's happening in this system that we're working within the UN. And I'm going to be talking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which is the main global governance regime for dealing with climate change. I'm then going to present the argument and the findings in two parts, and I'm going to talk about where and how we've been able to reach agreement on the topic in global governance, and I'm going to show how that agreement is undermined and unmade later on in the global public policy process. I'll close by articulating some of the contributions of the project. And so this is going to be really obvious to most people in the room, but it might be worth reminding ourselves of the three kinds of problems we deal with when we're talking about climate change. So there's first, kind of how do we prevent climate change? We call that mitigation. Two, how do we adapt to the impacts of climate change? That's adaptation. And 3, what do we do when we're unable to avert or minimize the impacts of climate change? And that's what we're talking about when we talk about loss and damage, those negative impacts of climate change that occur despite or in the absence of mitigation and adaptation. Right? And there's no official UN definition of climate change loss and damage. It's been so contentious within the global climate negotiations. But we do have a series of kind of dichotomies and categories in the way that we understand it, because this unruly weather continues to demand political attention. And so we might split those kind of events, climatic events, into one of 2 categories. We can think about those extreme weather events like heat waves, floods, droughts, cyclones, and we can think about those more slow-moving hazards like the rising of the seas, the degrading of land and forests, the acidification of the ocean, and the retreating of glaciers. And these different kinds of climatic events can result in different kinds of losses. So they can result in economic losses, like negative impacts on business operations, declining agricultural productivity, damage to infrastructure or property. But then we also have this whole other kind of set of losses, which in UN parlance is referred to as non-economic losses, a term I'm fairly sure was coined by an economist, right? This is all the stuff that kind of really matters in a way. And so here we talk about loss of life, negative impacts on physical health, on mental health, changing the ways that people move, forced displacement within countries, cross-border migration, loss of territory, loss of cultural heritage, and negative impacts on the environment, loss of biodiversity, and declining ecosystem services. So we have all these different forms of loss and intangible forms of harm. And this raises an interesting question, right? How did these events and impacts that manifest at the local level, affecting certain communities in certain places, come to be seen as something to be governed at the global level? Historically, these types of kind of natural disasters were understood to be the jurisdiction of national or subnational governments who were tasked with preparing for and mitigating and dealing with the recovery of these types of issues and events. What's changed? Well, for many people, this is a justice issue, right? We know that those countries and places that have contributed the least to the problem of climate change are already bearing the brunt of the impacts, right? So we know that kind of sub-Saharan Africa, small island developing states, and South Asia, so for example, Bangladesh there, are among the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. And yet they really have done the least to contribute to the problem. While China is currently the single largest greenhouse gas emitter by country, and the US is historically the largest greenhouse gas emitter, currently Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the US, Australia, and Canada all have more than twice the per capita emissions of China, and they each have more than 100 times the per capita emissions of several countries in Africa. So this raises this question: how do we resolve this issue? Where does responsibility lie, and how are those decisions going to be made? And that's what I'm looking at in this book. I'm trying to study and explain the emergence of this third pillar of climate policy in global governance. And in a lot of ways, its emergence is a bit surprising. Developed countries, rich countries, have been particularly resistant to the inclusion of any mentions of loss and damage in international law historically. So the United States, for example, Obama's negotiator, Todd Stern, at the Paris negotiations said, we don't accept and won't accept this idea that there should be liability and compensation for loss and damage. That's a line we can't cross. And he was saying that at that point, virtually all of the rich countries were on the same page on that. So there was a lot of resistance to this. And even John Kerry last year said, you tell me the government in the world that has trillions of dollars, because that's what loss and damage costs. And yet we have seen a number of milestones on loss and damage, right? And in some ways, this is pretty amazing. This is a system that relies on consensus of all of the world's countries, right? This isn't majority voting. This requires all 194 countries to come to agreement. And so we've seen a number of kind of key moments One was in 2013 with the adoption of what's been called the Warsaw International Mechanism and the establishment of an executive committee involving 10 people from developed countries and 10 people from developing countries who are tasked with trying to develop policies to respond to these kind of most egregious impacts of climate change. Last year, some of you might have remembered some of the newspaper headlines. We saw the agreement to establish in Sharm el-Sheikh a fund for loss and damage, as well as financial arrangements. All still to be fleshed out and a large part of the discussions for this year, but we have continued to see this progress. And so how can we explain that, right? And so that's the puzzle that's driving our work and the project. How have these agreements to govern loss and damage at the international level been reached despite strong resistance from key developed countries? And then that leads us to a broader theoretical question. How and when do ideas emerge and become institutionalized? How are they brought to life or instantiated when their underpinning principles are contested by powerful players? And existing theoretical explanations in international relations, I don't think really get us far enough. Neo-realists, for those of you who have studied international relations, will know that neo-realists believe that states are competing for power to enhance their security in an anarchical international system, right? And these theoretical approaches are useful in accounting for things like energy geopolitics or some of the failures in climate governance. But they tend to be relatively quiet on questions related to success in governance, right? They can't explain when and why we do get agreement. Liberal institutionalist approaches have been a mainstay of a lot of analysis in global environmental politics. These approaches understand that states are seeking to maximize absolute gains and that there is a role for international institutions in the delivery of mutual benefits for states. Right? And so this might include, for example, reducing transaction costs, allowing states to kind of engage with each other more easily, or facilitating the flow of information which benefits everyone, or ensuring monitoring and compliance in international regimes so that if people sign up to something, they know that they're not going to be betrayed by other states. I would argue this approach is less useful in accounting for some of the developments in the loss and damage stream. Let me give you one example. Small island states have been calling for enhanced information within this regime on climate risks, losses, and damages. They want every state to be able to put forward what they know about what climate risks and losses damage look like. This is a classic example of that information facilitation role, but this has been consistently refused by rich countries, right? So this goes against some of the assumptions of this liberal institutionalist approach. And there are other examples in dealing with loss and damage in the global stock take, for example. So I find those approaches not particularly persuasive here. Conventional constructivist accounts have looked beyond the role of states. So they might look to non-state actors or NGOs or epistemic agents like experts and scientists. They might look at secretariats of international institutions as autonomous political agents. But I think states are really at the heart of the loss and damage story. Civil society has certainly mattered, but I don't think they've been the kind of critical factor that has shifted us towards achieving some agreements in this area. And so what I do then is look at the role of ideas, and constructivist accounts have articulated the importance of the role of ideas. Constructivist accounts often look at what kinds of forms of governance or what types of policies are rendered possible or impossible by certain ideas, but they often fail to really trace through when and how those ideas matter and are brought to life. And so this is where my approach comes in. I'm situating myself in what's been coined the new constructivism. And my theoretical account is really focused on the making and unmaking of an object of global governance. And it's a two-part argument. First, I look at explicit contestation. I suggest that there are two competing framings or understandings of the problem of loss and damage, and that we see the development of international law on the topic when those two more polarized framings are set aside for a more ambiguous understanding of the problem. And so in an earlier piece, I talked about this as kind of the role of constructive ambiguity in international climate law. But having followed this in those years since, I then find that these two framings don't go away, right? They become instantiated through two different mechanisms, through the clandestine politics of institution building and through the performance of the mundane, everyday bureaucratic practices of international diplomacy. And so what I do to operationalize the theoretical approach is I draw on a number of techniques from sociology and rely on a wealth of qualitative data with a particular focus on ethnographic research. So our team has been working very hard to think about how can we bring the tools often used in anthropology and sociology into the discipline of political science. And there are many other scholars who have been kind of carving the path there, but what we haven't seen is this done in the field of global environmental politics. But so what our research has entailed is attending 7 rounds of the climate negotiations, half a dozen meetings of the Loss and Damage Executive Committee, totaling more than 400 hours of observation activity. We've done more than 150 interviews with diplomats, secretariat staff, scientists, experts, journalists, and those working in NGOs. And we've analyzed stacks and stacks of documents. I want to say a little bit more about methodology. When he was about 5, Sam asked me what I do when I go away on my work trips. And I explained that my job is to sit and watch meetings very carefully and to try to gather information by talking to people and asking people if they're willing to share documents with me. And he said, "So are you like a spy?" And I said, sorry, before I continue, is there anyone here from the UCL or the Departmental Research Ethics Committee? If yes, my response was that I undertake overt ethnographic research with full knowledge and consent of all participants, and that we have undertaken careful ethical assessments in all of the national jurisdictions we've been to, and we undertake risk and security assessment, and we follow all national and institutional protocols when it comes to data gathering, storage, dissemination, and transfer. But what I really said when Sam asked if I was a spy was kind of. And it's been a real pleasure, and for someone who I think really values relationships, ethnographic work has really suited me very well. But there's always this issue of proximity. So sometimes I can get very, very close to negotiators or ministers when doing ethnographic work in Antigua, but sometimes we can't even get in the room. So this is at the Glasgow negotiations, and the negotiations were happening down the hall. Sometimes we can get in the room, but we spend a lot of time sitting on the floor. And there's some colleagues, we often meet with colleagues sitting on the floor. And oftentimes I'll walk around the negotiations trying to find someone for hours, sometimes days, and I'll walk into a room and see members of the team on the screen because the negotiators are being focused on. And so I'm like, okay, there's Angelica. I know that she's okay, and we're doing my security risk assessment thing, and everyone's all right. But in all seriousness, we've produced, I think, a really interesting piece of research published in Global Environmental Politics, the journal, looking at some of the kind of interesting and perhaps overlooked elements in doing ethnographic research in these negotiations. And so, for example, we've been doing some thinking about the politics of chairs. Who gets to sit in a chair? And what does that mean? What does it allow you to see or to say if you're sat on the ground or if you can't get in the room? And what does that mean for the transparency of the governance of this planet that we're sharing? And my PhD student, Frances, had a wonderful, she's doing research on coastal Louisiana and attended a meeting there with some of the local community where there were no chairs, and she had asked someone why there was no chairs, and they said because at the last meeting people had started throwing the chairs. And I thought it was a wonderful insight from her part, and so we're hoping as a follow-on from this piece on deploying an ethnographic sensibility to do something on the kind of material elements of these contexts. I want to come in the next 10 minutes I want to cover, I suppose, some of the kind of main findings and elements of the argument, though you'll read the book in due course and capture the whole picture, and it's a very rich story we're telling. But let me talk a little bit about how we did get to a point where we got some agreement, and then where and when that agreement starts to come apart, and how that's done in, I would argue, a nefarious and invisible way. So I rely on the tools of Irving Goffman, who's a sociologist, who defines a frame as a schemata of interpretation. And I use frame analysis in a lot of my work. He defines framing processes as shaping which issues are seen as problems, which are discussed, and which are then taken up for action. And social movement scholars talk about diagnostic framing, right? How do we define what the problem is, what the boundaries of that problem are? And prognostic framing, which is the corollary. What are the roles and responsibilities and responses that align with that diagnosis of the problem? And so, we look at mountains and mountains of data, but let me give you like a little flavor of the kinds of things that I look at in the book. So, for example, in a newsletter that covers all the negotiations, this is as early as 2004, a developing country framing of loss and damage looks a little bit like this. The possibility is emerging that life could soon become intolerable in some parts of some countries. The issue will then arise of compensation to these countries. We need to prepare for scenarios where damages exceed adaptation capacity. Someone I interviewed from a developing country said loss and damage is a euphemism for liability and compensation. There's always an assertion that this UN regime, the climate change regime, is the relevant policy forum for discussing loss and damage. And there's a lot of talk about suffering and vulnerability. On the other hand, developed countries talk about this a little bit differently. So in 2010, the EU, in a statement to the UN, said, we prefer to have climate-related damage addressed at the national level. The US has also consistently articulated this idea that they have serious concerns about the development of a global facility because this could inhibit a country-driven approach. When developed countries, rich countries, do tend to talk about loss and damage and maybe create some room for it within this regime, they tend to limit the role of this regime in terms of focusing on knowledge or enhancing understanding. So that's like a little flavor of the kind of data that we looked at. And from that, what we did is articulate two different distinct framings of this problem of loss and damage. The first one, which I'm calling a risk and uncertainty framing, and the second one, which I'm calling a harm and injustice framing. And so in this risk framing, there's an emphasis on uncertainty about whether climate change is even driving these impacts that we're seeing, uncertainty about whether, when, and where climate change impacts will manifest. And there's a lot of emphasis on the social and political construction of vulnerability, which tends to lie at the national level as the assumption. And so if we understand the problem of climate change, loss, and damage as one of risk or uncertainty, then the appropriate roles and responsibility and responses include more emphasis on the leaders of developing countries to minimize their vulnerability and to manage their risks better. And if developed countries have any kind of role here, it's to act as effective donors and maybe to catalyze private sector finance. And so here you hear a lot of talk about insurance, how the insurance industry is going to save us when it comes to climate change and loss and damage. There's also a certain articulation here about the role of global governance, which is a fairly thin understanding of what the role of the UN is in addressing this problem when we understand it in this particular way. So this framing tends to query whether the UNFCCC is the appropriate venue to deal with this. And what we hear a lot is this is something that should be dealt with in the disaster risk management realm and the Sendai framework. But of course, that particular framework is a voluntary framework mainly focused on kind of enhancing and sharing knowledge rather than the stronger, more robust UN climate change regime. When loss and damage is acknowledged as something worth dealing with within this particular framing, it's always lumped in with adaptation, and this idea that it's a third pillar has been rejected consistently over years. And that committee that I talked about at the beginning, those 10 developing country members that are meant to deal with these issues, their role is really framed as a catalytic one, right? Their responsibility is to get other organizations, other UN agencies to think about climate risk, not necessarily do anything themselves, and funding situation often reflects this framing. The harm frame, on the other hand, tends to see the problem of loss and damage as one of injustice, and there's an emphasis on attributing responsibility for climate change to the major emitters, right? This is linking that kind of perpetrator-victim relationship in a way that the risk framing doesn't. There's also an emphasis within this particular framing on the full range of kinds of forms of harm, from the economic to what we call non-economic. And the responsibility here of developed countries is to really step up and remedy the harm done by their historic greenhouse gas emissions, including for permanent losses. And the rhetoric in the kind of early decades of this discussion was on compensation and liability, and that's where that language really comes from. But we have seen a shift, I think largely because of a disciplining on the part of the rich countries, of the developing countries' discussions about this, towards an acceptance that this would be on the basis of solidarity rather than compensation or liability. But actors and developing countries and their civil society allies that put forward this framing very much see the UNFCCC as the primary place for dealing with this problem. They see loss and damage very much as a third pillar, as separate, and they see that executive committee, they really want to kind of thicken that institution. They want it to have more funding, to have more support in order to be able to really do things on the ground. They want it to be more of an operational organization. So we have these two distinctive framings of loss and damage, right? We've got one that understands this as a problem of risk and uncertainty, placing the responsibility on national leaders of developing countries and seeing a limited role for global governance. And on the other hand, we see this as a problem of harm and injustice, and that developed countries have a responsibility to remedy the issue, and that there's a key role for global governance, right? So we have these two quite polarized framings. How did we end up reaching agreement? And what I argue is that there's the emergence of a more ambiguous understanding of loss and damage. This idea of achieving consensus in the plural, where everyone can bring their different meanings and different understandings to the table, and that we're going to walk away with that. And we found some evidence to kind of show this playing out. And so what this graph shows, we did a content analysis of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is a newsletter that covers every day of the negotiations. And we coded that, going right back to almost the beginning of the regime. And we coded for kind of two different terms, which I use as a proxy. So we coded for mentions of insurance, which I use as a proxy for that risk and uncertainty framing. And we looked for mentions of liability and compensation, so representing that kind of injustice and harm framing. And so what we found is that the way that this issue, or this problem that we're talking about, was kind of talked about in those two ways, right up until after 2009, the Copenhagen negotiations. And then we see the emergence of this more opaque framing, this term loss and damage, this one in red here. And we see that really rising while these other ones go a little bit quiet, up until 2013, when we had that moment where loss and damage was first embedded in international law, right? And so we see that happening in this moment. Then right before the Paris negotiations, we see a little kind of spike again of the two distinctive framings. But ever since then, it's this loss and damage discussion that's really dominated. And so we're all kind of in agreement in some ways in the world that we're going to hold on to this like broad, ambiguous understanding. But that allowed for some progress in international law, right? And so 5 years ago, I was probably more optimistic. But it's the second part of the story, which I will cover in the next 4 minutes, that really, I think, is the part that is a bit more worrying. And this is the part where we can't just look at what happens in law, and we can't just look at what happens at these global negotiations, because it's those post-treaty politics, I think, that matter as much as what happens in those negotiations. And so we need to look beyond the headlines. So the second part studies how these competing frames translate into the way that these institutions around loss and damage are being built, and ultimately shapes the behavior and activities of political actors, practitioners, and experts, and increasingly will determine where and how money will flow in order to address this problem that we're broadly calling loss and damage, but is actually a really broad motley crew of issues. So in the book, I identify a number of different mechanisms through which these competing ideas of loss and damage are brought to life, in the way that priorities are decided and the types of outputs that are kind of developed by this committee. I want to focus on two of them here very briefly, and this is a focus on that executive committee that I've been watching and sitting very late into the night watching their meetings. And I have to say, I appreciate my boss so much more for our staff meetings after having sat through 400 hours of watching this committee's meetings and the way that they are run. The tools that I use here are from Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, and it's really this idea of description is social science too, right? That a lot of what matters, I think, in this particular space and in this implementation stage of global public policy is looking behind the mundane and the everyday and the seemingly irrelevant. And so I draw on his notion of habitus, and this is the idea that it captures the embodied kind of positioned way in which individuals are shaped by their position within social fields and the taken for granted knowledge that they bring to it. And I use a technique called practice tracing. And this deconstructs the meaning of practices. And by practices, I mean ways of doing things. So it deconstructs the meaning of these practices in a local setting in order to take stock of kind of the largely tacit know-how, right? This kind of intersubjective thing that we all know what we're doing here during an inaugural lecture when I'm the one standing at the front talking. We all understand what's supposed to happen, even when I'm crying. So as a method, this idea of practice tracing takes the causality of practices seriously. It's ways of doing things make other things happen. And so one way of doing things is the way that states appoint people to this committee and the areas of expertise of these particular members. So we coded the public profiles of the members over the first 6 years of this committee. And this might be a little bit difficult to see, but what we find is that a lot of the themes that fall within that risk management understanding of loss and damage, a lot of developed countries appointed people with that kind of expertise to sit on this committee. So, they had worked in adaptation, risk management. There were people with particular expertise in insurance. Resilience is another really popular word in this particular space. And I associate all of that with that risk and uncertainty framing. And what you'll notice here is a lot of those other elements of loss and damage. So there was no expertise on migration or displacement or mental health impacts of climate change. There was no indigenous representation within this committee. There was no one who had any knowledge or expertise of cultural heritage loss. So what we end up having is certainly among the rich country members of this committee, a particular form of expertise. And what I particularly, I like this phrase of, if all you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. And so this is like very well-meaning people, but half of them come into this particular space thinking this is about managing risk and managing uncertainty rather than dealing with kind of harm or injustice. And so we found some kind of interview evidence that bore this out as well, right? The disaster risk reduction people are all the developed country people, and they're trying to reorient this towards a disaster risk reduction agenda, right? So trying, as this institution is being developed, to have a thinner version of what it possibly could be. In another piece of work that we published in Climate Policy last year, we look at the way in which this committee implemented its work plan. And I worked in strategy consulting for a little while. My boss from that time is here. And I can't quite believe that I signed up and it was really my team that did all the heavy lifting on this. But we very carefully scrutinized kind of project management practices of this particular committee. So we looked at what did people say they were going to do, what did they then say they had done, and what had they actually done. And my team trolled for hours and hours and hours through, I see trauma on Angelica's face, through these piles of documents. And we found a few different trends. One is this idea of technocratic offloading, and Angelica's done a wonderful PhD kind of developing this further. But what we saw is that the executive committee really, really delayed to set up these expert groups that were meant to like support them, right? This like science policy interface and evidence-based policy making. But the ones on, like, for example, comprehensive risk management were set up really early, and the one dealing with funding for loss and damage was delayed for years and years and years, right? And yet they were all kind of within the same work plan. So, and then we also see this practice of kind of moving a lot of the work that this group of people should be doing to these experts who are not funded. It's not part of their day job. They get no money to kind of help advance the work within this particular area, right? So we have this kind of hollow kind of set of bodies trying to do this. We also see what I call forum bumping and jumping, where a particular issue might be said to be dealt with better within another part of the convention or another institution, or the executive committee says, when dominated by developed countries, says, we don't quite know what we're meant to be doing here, so we'll go and ask all 194 countries at the next negotiations for clarity on this, or whether we really need to do this. And they'll say, yes, we really want you to think about how we can develop finance to deal with this problem. And then they'll delay and delay and delay. And so we find a number of these kind of different mechanisms through which that plays out. I'm conscious I'm at time now, so I just want to draw together a few of the contributions that I'm trying to make in this book. So here I'm talking really about two different senses of the idea of making or constructing climate change loss and damage. I'm understanding it as kind of the construction of an object of global governance. So before we even get to that agenda setting phase of global public policy development, we have to understand what the object is. And I think this research is really trying to show that. I'm also trying to develop an argument that loss and damage is really, as a material reality, it is becoming worse because of the slow violence, to use Rob Nixon's terms, because of the slow violence of the consequences of delays and obfuscation in the climate change regime. And so while I was relatively optimistic kind of 5 or 6 years ago that international law in this area was progressing, the way that I see that kind of object being undone and questioned, and the way that I see governance being hollowed out really concerns me. So I think this helps advance our understanding of kind of how international law is made and then sometimes undermined or destroyed through the everyday practices of governing. The project is trying to advance this new constructivism by bridging insights from frame theory, political ethnography, science and technology studies, and the practice turn in IR. And we're also really excited about these methodological contributions that we're making. We also have another stream of the project, which is looking at 11 different countries and how national level policymakers are conceptualizing and thinking about this problem of loss and damage, which is not one that they would really necessarily recognize as such. This is a construct of global governance. And so what does it mean when it translates to these different places? And we have a wonderful, wonderful team of kind of early, mainly early career scholars who've worked with us in these particular places, which I have to say was one of the silver linings of the COVID crisis. We were meant to travel to most of these places and we didn't, and yet I have gained so much and think this is a real way forward for doing research, particularly on climate change, in working in collaboration in this particular way. And of course, my son Sam has been doing his own part. You can see him there studying coastal erosion in Antigua, testing different techniques to build more climate resilient sand castles. But I suppose I want to conclude by making very clear to him and to everyone in this room that this isn't Sam's work to do, of course. This is our work to do. And I think the way to do this, here she goes. I think ultimately this entails leaning into loss. And Meg and I had a wonderful conversation today about the toll that this work can take and yet the importance of it. And we talk as a team a lot about the risk of researcher burnout or depression or existential questions when doing this kind of work. But I think it is really important to lean into loss and to not look away. And I think there are really two roles that we need to play as academics, as political scientists, as social scientists. And that's one, it's about being honest about the science and the scale of the challenge that we face. And I think we have a role, and my partner Stephen and I have talked about this a lot, the role of this kind of work is about documenting those failures when we see them, particularly when they're hidden. And then we need to challenge the failures of our political leaders. And I think that's the role that we can play. And by leaning into loss, maybe there's something to be gained. Thank you very much.
Well, gosh, wasn't that amazing? Lisa and I have done some teaching together, and whenever we do that, I sort of just sit in the audience transfixed. And that was exactly kind of how I felt tonight, powerful, authentic, compelling. So good evening, I'm Stephen. My task for tonight, giving an appreciation, being appreciative of Lisa, is a really easy one because Lisa is an exceptional scholar and a brilliant person. So it's a real pleasure to be here, although I feel I should apologise. I'm now the only thing standing between you and a glass of wine, so I'll be brief. I'd heard a lot about Lisa before I first met her. I had heard about this research millionaire with a ginormous grant from the EU. I'd heard about someone doing genuinely world-leading socio-political, socio-legal work, her background at Oxford, McGill, Sciences Po, the LSE, someone who was also deeply committed, I was told, to the active improvement of civil society and social justice. I mean, she sounded too good to be true. And then I met Lisa and realized that everything that was said was just wholly accurate. And when I was thinking about what I was going to say this evening, I was trying to find a single word that I thought summed up Lisa and what I know of and respect about her work. And I settled on thoughtful. So thoughtful as to the research she chooses to engage in, research that matters, making a difference, as Chris said earlier. Thoughtful about the methods she deploys to respond to the research questions she sets for herself. Thoughtful about what she says with her work and how she says it. Thoughtful about the audiences she engages with. And thoughtful about her role as a senior leader in the field and in the university. So let me unpack some aspects of that thoughtfulness. So in her inaugural, Lisa just spoke about her research on governing the end, this first systematic socio-legal account of the origins, micropolitics, negotiations, etc., in relation to climate change, loss and damage. And as you heard, it is also work that is deeply thoughtful about the place and importance of theory. It provides a critical and rigorous discussion with theoretical frameworks that have emerged in parallel, drawing on new constructivism in the field of international relations, to anthropology and international law, socio-legal theories on global governance. Now, putting theory together from different places in a way that makes sense and is more than a sum of its parts is no easy task. And yet what Lisa does is to do this in a way that is critical, creative, and compelling. As you heard Lisa allude to in the final few minutes, her work, like the work of many others, was deeply impacted by COVID. But instead of hunkering down and waiting for the storm to pass, Lisa decided to pivot away from doing her climate change fieldwork in many of her case study countries, and instead to focus energy and effort in engaging and collaborating with early career researchers across the global south to produce work that we expect will soon be published as the national turn, the first book-length treatment of climate loss and damage policy and politics at the national level. Now, that collaboration with Global South early career researchers is a really good example of how much people matter to Lisa and her work. And I said earlier, Lisa was thoughtful as a leader. I know this on a personal level, having worked with her. Ben mentioned the work she's done as Director of Research and now Deputy Head in the Department of Political Science. I also spoke with members of Lisa's ERC project team. They talk of her creativity, flexibility, rigor, and her ethic of care. One said that Lisa, quote, encourages each of us to believe in our futures. And that seems to me the single most important thing that a leader can do. Lisa also, I'm told, sets small social tasks for each project meeting of her ERC team, including one recently on favourite Eurovision songs. Given that, I felt it important to say for the record, and apologies to Lisa's mother and her Finnish heritage, that Norway was robbed this year. When academics say the word methodology, some people can tend to switch off, and that's because, unless you're Lisa, talking about methodology can be terribly dry and dull. And yet, if an academic isn't sensitive to the options they have before them as to how they do their research, or isn't reflective about ways of seeing, then the resulting claims coming out of the research can lack substance and be unpersuasive. But short, methodology matters. And it obviously matters to Lisa because, as you heard, she is so thoughtful about methodology in her work. The point I want to make here is that part of the quality of Lisa's work comes from the rigor and thoughtfulness she applies to the choices she made about how to go about that work. And at a time when there are scholars, activists, policymakers, practitioners, journalists, and others really struggling to understand the stakes and frames and content of this newly visible issue of climate loss and damage, Lisa's more than 5 years of thoughtful ethnographic work, being in the room where it happened, and over 150 interviews, allow her and then us to see something different and important in terms of how international climate law is developing. In being thoughtful about how she uses her research and her academic expertise, Lisa works with a range of bodies, most recently with the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK, to inform their thinking on the equality impacts of climate change, working with her colleague Dr. Fergus Green, and via a new project with the United Nations Environment Programme on its adaptation gap report. And through her consulting and other public service work, Lisa brings conceptual frameworks to life in legal practice spaces, and that allows individuals, organisations, and communities to measure and reflect on the impact of their work in new ways. And Lisa has supported organisations in a diverse range of fields: juvenile justice, social care, welfare benefits, immigration, climate justice, climate adaptation. I could go on. And much of that work has been about developing new collaborations and partnerships and exploring ways for grassroots communities or geographic regions that have been able to previously mobilise the law to do so. As I said before, and I do think it's worth saying again, people really matter to Lisa, to the work that she does and how she uses her expertise. I asked Dr. Jackie Kingan, sat at the back, one of Lisa's long-term collaborators, about working with Lisa on the various projects they've done together. Jackie said to me, "What to say about Lisa? Driven, fiercely intelligent, thoughtful, committed, incisive," then a pause, "annoyingly good at timekeeping." And so, conscious of time myself, I shall end there. Many congratulations.